Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this session. I just want to kind of start off by saying I know we've all experienced situations where we kind of say, wow, I've never seen this coming, or kind of how did this happen? Or also on the flip side, we've kind of looked from the outside for either people in our personal lives or in our professional lives or out in broader, in society, thinking, giving them guidance to say, maybe you should consider this, or, do you realize that this is happening in front of you? And they kind of say to you, no, everything's fine. I know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. Things are going to be great. And, I'm pleased to introduce Michele Wucker, who I know really got tired of hearing people say that and say that they've never seen it coming when the signs are really right in front of them and they were very probable and they had high impacts and risks, and we just all chose to neglect them. And I think it's fantastic, Michele, that you really took that step to really write a book with the Gray Rhino and really telling us all how do we recognize, or sharing with us how do we recognize and act on these obvious dangers that we choose to ignore, as well as taking a step further with the Gray Rhino and Company to educate organizations and individuals and how to apply this way of thinking in our world and transform how we engage and address these problems. So would you want to take a minute and introduce yourself as well, and things that you want people to kind of recognize about yourself before we get started on the other questions?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I was so excited to hear from you guys, and that the theme of this is so important and timely. And the last panel just started, sending light bulbs going off over
Right.
my head. So super excited to be a part of this. In a former life, I was a financial journalist, writing actually first about the Argentine debt crisis, and later running a think tank in New York, and still very involved in economic and financial crisis and debt issues. Wrote a paper about Greece, saying, "Hey, Greece, learn from Argentina." 9 months before the collapse, there was a proposal to do a preemptive restructuring. Nobody wanted to do it. Instead of losing 30%, they lost 70%. You know, hello.
Mm.
And I noticed such a shift in attitudes. When I wrote about Argentina, I was running the Latin America Bureau for International Financing Review, and as soon as I wrote about that proposal, the phone started ringing off the hook. This is when like people actually talk by phone. All these bankers going, "I think you're so right, but we can't say it publicly, otherwise we're going to be fired." And so then in spring of 2011, I wrote this paper about Greece with New America and the World Policy Institute. And it went on CNBC Worldwide Exchange as a guest host talking about it. And that seemed to, open the floodgates where, for months and months, people were saying, yes, this is what needs to happen. And of course, Greece came to an agreement with its creditors. And yes, people still lost a lot of money, but it didn't take the whole euro down with it. And so it saved a lot of pain. And that really got me to ask, why did Argentina and Greece both see this big thing coming at them? And Greece got it together and Argentina didn't. So I started asking questions about that. And then I realized the question was so relevant to so many other things. I, work in big policy issues, climate change, and I've got all sorts of thoughts about the financial pandemic that we're going through right now, which so many people saw coming and hollered about. And I came up with the Gray Rhino really as a way to make it easier for people to talk about those sort of things with a big horn coming right at you. And
Right.
there's something of a reaction to the black swan, but it's gray instead of black, because gray is the color that all rhinos are, even though of the five species, one is white in quotes and one is black in quotes, and that's not the case in either one. So it was a way to emphasize this idea that we do see things, but we deliberately look away or confuse things.
So, Michele, to that point, how would you distinguish between the Gray Rhino and the Black Swan from your perspective? What are those key distinctions?
So black swan, you can only see in hindsight, despite this, mini industry of armchair black swan spotters that completely miss the point of the book. You can only see it once it's already happened. It's in the rear view mirror. Highly improbable, unforeseeable, unimaginable, not within the scope of your imagination. What's useful about the concept is that it should help you to expand your imagination. Be aware that yes, something could come and whoop you upside with a 2x4, as we said when I lived in Texas when I was growing up. And to build more resilient systems. I think that part of the concept is very productive. Unfortunately, it was misused and became a cop out. Oh, nobody saw it coming. Wash my hands of it. So that's the black swan. And the gray rhino is something that's that's obvious. Well, it's more obvious to some people, but there are at least some people who are out there screaming, we need to do something about this. Highly probable. Again, different people have different levels of confidence with, how probable something is. People estimate those probabilities differently, but it's likely to happen. You may not necessarily know when. They're different types. Some of them are right on top of you, some of them a little bit further down, but it's obvious, it's probable. Unlike the elephant in the room, which by definition normalizes people saying and doing nothing, but just kind of stands there and you're sort of okay if you leave it in the corner. That's not the case with the gray rhino. If you ignore it, you're gonna get trampled. And there are people saying things and doing things. It's just there are not enough of them. So it's forward looking instead of backward looking.
Oh, thank you. And hey, so thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it, Michele. So to that point, can I ask you a question? So why do you feel that people ignore the obvious problems or block them out, and they're not seeing what's really, we're missing what's right in front of them?
Such a good question, and obviously something I thought a lot about. And there are a few buckets of explanations. The first one is that we have um, these defense mechanisms. They're just little gremlins in our brains that, like antibodies to a virus or something, are there to protect us. But sometimes they go completely haywire, and we get sick because these little antibodies. And one of them is that if something's so big and overwhelming, we digest it in little pieces to make it manageable. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talks about this in her work on denial and grief. The other part of it is that when you have something that's always there, like, I grew up in the Midwest in Texas. I live in Chicago now. It's about a 15-minute walk from the L train, but we can still hear it every once in a while, except I don't because I live there. If you have a constant thing that's constantly interrupting you, dragging you down, that denial becomes a really helpful defense mechanism, so you can focus on the stuff that you need to focus on. So there are these sort of cognitive biases, defense mechanisms that make us vulnerable. And it's something I get a lot of pushback on in the West, where people really don't want to hear that they're vulnerable because I guess they don't want to accept it. But it's such a big step to be able to come out and say, hey, yes, we are so much more likely than we want to admit to ignore the obvious, to deny it. And once you recognize that, you can do something about it. So it's a real source of strength. So the psychological and cognitive side, then there's sort of, structural, how we make decisions issues. When you're in a group, people are much more likely to listen to what the first person said and emphasize it instead of listening to the information that they don't want to hear. So there's a group decision-making problem. There's an incentives problem. With companies, you've got quarterly earnings reports. I was actually very happy to read recently that a lot of companies this quarter are just throwing up their hands. Oh, we have no idea what it's going to be. That's actually, I think, quite productive. But such a short-term focus actually ends up destroying long-term value. Same is true in politics and democracies, where you've got fairly short terms, and people make the decisions that are going to keep them in office, but that longer term are more damaging. So we've got cognitive, we've got structural decision making, we've got perverse incentives, and then on the really sinister end of it, you have people who understand those barriers and take advantage of them. So we saw that with tobacco, with fossil fuel industries. The marketers are very good. They know that people don't want to hear the hard answer, and so they take advantage of it. So there are many cases in which we're being manipulated when we're not as aware as we should be of this sort of gray rhino blinder that we have on.
Michele, to that point, quick question.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, to that point, do you think an event or a situation could be a black swan and a gray rhino, depending on the perspective you're coming from? Or do you think, meaning that we all have our perspective because of our experiences in life, and so maybe something that you would see coming, or it should be very obvious to you, may be different for me because of the experiences? Or do you think it's really just what you mentioned, which is maybe I'm just really more in denial about it because I can't handle it, handle the overwhelming nature of it, where maybe you could?
Again, such a great question. I'm loving this conversation with you guys. Well, it's like, that's why we have specialization, that there are people who are paid and spend their entire days and sometimes, keeping up at night thinking about how do we protect ourselves from the next pandemic. Oh, what do we do about this big financial bubble that's going to be a big mess when it bursts? So, not every single person has to pay that level of attention to things, but there are also people, people we elect, business leaders whose job it is to sort out all of those different threats. And they need to be making a decision. And if they're not, then they need to be held accountable. I talked about this defensiveness a little bit, and I think a lot of people do feel a bit like, I shouldn't have seen the pandemic coming. Well, no, you shouldn't have. But once you knew about it, you should be putting your freaking mask on. So they're very different from different angles. And it's interesting. I get asked a lot, what are the top gray rhinos? Is this a gray rhino? Is that a gray rhino? And I've started to get very sensitive about answering that questions because the point of the concept is not for me to be the great gray rhino spotter in the world. It only works if people own the concept for themselves. And the same gray rhino is going to look very different from different perspectives. I mean, the top 0.1% inequality is a very different question for them than what it is for the bottom however many percent. And I think some of the challenge is really reframing these gray rhinos so that people who don't necessarily think it applies to them understand how it could affect them. I mean, with inequality, we heard all this discussion last year about pitchforks. Are they coming at us with the pitchforks? And my sense is, yeah, eventually they are, but that's not even the biggest reason you should be worried about this. If you look at this this very, very expansive monetary policy, creating these big giant stock market bubbles with price earning ratios of in the hundreds and even in thousands, which is not sustainable. And at some point, if you don't support the real economy, that house of cards is going to come tumbling down way worse than it has in the last couple months. And I just read yesterday, I think NASDAQ has gone back into the positive for the year. So I think that it really is a matter of framing, and it's a matter of everyone, every organization, every political leader, and every individual even looking ahead and saying, what's my gray rhino? What's the big thing coming at me with its name tattooed on its forehead or on its horn? What am I doing about it? And could I be doing better? Who do I need to help me to fix this problem? Are they on board? If not, then what do we need to do to get them on board? So this question of perception is so important because we don't see them all the same way, and we don't have to, but there are some that we absolutely have responsibility to be on top of, and that's something we need much more self-awareness about.
So to that question then, so there's so many things that out there that people are trying to figure out. How do business leaders figure out their gray rhinos, and then how do they figure out which ones to focus on?
It's such a great question. I think there are two parts of that. There's really one, the decision making process, and the second part is the going through the taxonomy of the gray rhino. What is it that's in front of you? How many of them, which is the most important? Can you fix this gray rhino by itself without also dealing with the other ones around it? Decision making, I often call a meta gray rhino. It's a sort of a structural challenge that you have to fix before you can solve some of the other problems. When you're prioritizing, a lot of the questions that I put out there are, how big is it? How fast is it coming at you? How close that is it? What's its relationship to some of the other problems out there? If you solve this, are you going to solve a bunch of problems downstream? If you try to solve this, are you going to be able to solve it without looking upstream at the problems that are creating that? And so the first part of your question, the decision making, is so much at the heart of that. I often think about the biggest gray rhino really being this resistance to taking a fresh look at the obvious and to realizing we're not doing as good a job as we can. That also comes down to knowing that you as the CEO don't have to know absolutely everything to solve the problem. You're not solving it all in your head and then just bestowing your solutions on your minions and getting them to go and execute it. It's realizing what other people are better at doing than you are. It's about making sure that you're speaking to the challenges that all of your stakeholders have. Are you listening to your employees, to your suppliers, to your customers, to your partners? Are you looking more broadly at the community? Are you listening to get those signals? Because in so many cases, it's not a case of, the signals weren't there, the signals were too weak. It was that the response delivery mechanism was too weak. And so that's why you see so much attention to board governance these days. And it's why that they added the G to ESG, environmental, social, and governance is so important. We've seen a lot of emphasis on risk identification, particularly over the last 10 years. All this, there's so much money into these risk identification and assessment systems. Um, Assessing the probability is only as good as the data that goes into it and the human element. And responding to that is only as good as the human element. So I think that businesses also need to just take a really good hard look at themselves in the mirror. How is my board making decisions? Does everybody just sort of nod their head when the chairman says some proclamation? Or do you really have structured debate? Do you have a devil's advocate? Are you willing to go through and talk about the things that you don't want to admit are possibilities? Are you overconfident? Are you underconfident? Are you the Goldilocks level of confident? So that really just looking very hard at your decision-making process, at your biases, and correcting for them when you recognize them.
Thank you. No, I
So,
appreciate
Michele,
it.
yeah, that's great. And I know you talked about, and I know you can talk, the first step is kind of like denial. So you may not necessarily admit that you have the gray rhinos, but then once you kind of get through that step and you say, okay, I recognize my gray rhinos, but then what do I have to do to kind of action them? And you talked a bit about the defense mechanisms that kick in. And one of the things I found intriguing about you is that I know one of the things you've done is you founded kind of this innovative way of helping, an experiential way of helping organizations and their leaders into kind of, I guess, embracing this. And you kind of grounded it in a dance, the tango. And I know you have your tango and leadership. Can you share with me kind of your inspiration for this and how it applies for them, that not only seeing the problem and getting past that denial, but how they then kind of use that to kind of get over it and take the actions that are needed? So how do they relate? And then how do they experience that, out of curiosity?
Yeah, well, so I'm so glad you picked up on the tango thing. So many years ago, I was actually quite serious about the tango. I was going 3 or 4 nights a week in New York, and I had this fantastic teacher, Pablo Pugliese, who's now working with me and with Nancy Ankowitz, business communications coach. And when he was talking about different steps, he would tell these great stories. And one of them was about his parents, who were, just legends in Argentina, who basically trained all of the current generation of tango teachers and put a lot of emphasis on the follower, not just the leader. That is not just the leader pushing the follower around; it's a leader figuring out how to really showcase the follower, because the follower is the one who does all the fancy kicks and the really impressive stuff and has the gorgeous dress and stuff. So Pablo was telling this story about a move. It's called like a drag, where the leader takes the follower's foot and they kind of drag it across the floor. And so he said his mother and father went out to this bar, and the mother did not want to go. She didn't want to go. I don't remember why. And she was just in a really bad mood. And so he wanted to do this drag. And instead of her letting her foot be dragged, she just put it down and he tripped. So it's a great example of, if your follower is not doing what you want them to do, well, maybe think a little bit about why. So in 2017, the World Economic Forum, where I'm very involved as now an alumna of, I've got gray hair. I can't really call myself a young global leader, although by some standards I am. Certainly by corporate board standards, I would be. But so they were holding the annual summit in Buenos Aires, where I hadn't been for 20 years, and just got so excited. So I said, look, we have to do something at this summit with all these leadership lessons that Pablo shared with me. So I looked him up. He put me in touch with a teacher in Argentina. And so we did a workshop there, and then I came back and I reached out to my friend Nancy, and we did a couple pilot workshops in New York. We've done a video, we've done a lot of writing, and we've got a whole curriculum around it. It's with the pandemic, it's it's a little bit on hold, but it really is about communication. It's about feedback. It's about accepting feedback, And with the tango, even these workshops we did obviously were very basic. We started out with walking around the room together, which it was surprising to see the insights that people came up with out of something just so basic. They said, "Oh, this made me completely rethink how I communicate. When I think I'm leading, I'm not ever really sure that people are getting the message, and I need to rethink and pay attention to how people are getting the message." And that simplicity is something that I think is very much part of the gray rhino. I mean, this question, what's my gray rhino? What's the big thing in front of me that I'm missing? I mean, it's like it's almost crazily simple, and we don't pay enough attention to some of those really simple, profound questions about purpose, about communication, about perception, about stepping back and thinking what the big picture is. And those are all the things that get you through a situation of uncertainty like the one that we're living in. It's really going back to what's the most powerful thing about you.
Mhm.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. So just to that point, can you share what are some of the warning signals of a gray rhino or a business, especially people in business? What are some signals that they should be looking at that gray rhino or a black swan is about to hit them?
um, well, I think one of the biggest warning signals is when you're not looking for warning signals. Um,
Hmm.
one of the things I like to look at in in the markets, which is of course where my career started, in the capital markets, particularly emerging markets. So I looked at those movements quite a bit, and when people were really euphoric, that would always send off alarm bells. Um, and I often look at the fear and greed index. If greed is really high, then I get really scared, and the opposite. I remember in 2009, I forget, it was like February or March. It was right near the actual bottom. I had dinner with an old friend from the Wall Street Journal who was in town, and we were talking, and it was like that week where it just felt like the sky was falling, and it was this existential moment. And I said to him, I mean, there was some red wine involved, but I was like, I think today was the bottom. He's like, no, 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 no. And of course, I was right. I hate to say I told you, but okay, that's part of the story. I was really, really right. So, looking at sentiments, is someone overconfident? Are they really looking at the possibility that your best case scenario and your worst case scenario are realistic? So it's, is someone listening to feedback? Are they com-
Speaking
no
of
feedback?
feedback.
Yeah, not that kind of feedback. No, no, no. Get rid of that kind of feedback. Is it signal or is it noise, as they say? But looking at mood and personality. Actually, my friend Peter Atwater does some really great work on this, around confidence and social mood, both looking at market signals, but also levels of confidence that people have, and how those levels of confidence and decisions change, how your scope of perception really changes depending on when you're completely panicked or if you're just feeling way too good about yourself. So that's really, I think, where the signals are. But then, of course, you want to come up with some ways of tracking some quantitative or other flags that will trigger something. I think humans are really bad at um, reacting in real time in appropriate ways. So I think there's some cases where, if you've got an algorithm or something pulling in all the data, that when that algorithm sends out a red flag that, hey, this market is in danger territory, then you need to be sure that you're willing to pay attention to that and not override it. So it's a combination of the human and the quantitative elements.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great.
Lisa, go
So
ahead. I know you had some questions
okay.
that you wanted to ask too, so go ahead.
No, all good. Yeah, all good. It's just a quick question, just with respect to from a technology side. Do you feel as though the use of technology creates gray rhinos, or the way we use
Yes,
technology today?
it's both ways. It's actually, like the gray rhino itself, it's value neutral. You can get trampled by the rhino, or you can hop on its back and it can take you for a wonderful ride with its power and trample your enemies. Um, but technology is, it goes both ways. It helps us to make all sorts of decisions and analyze data in ways we could never ever do on our own. It makes a lot of things much cheaper. Um, but then on the other hand, when you look at the algorithms, a lot of them, people don't really know what's going on inside the black box. The algorithms are only as good as the people who designed them, and you've read a lot about the biases in algorithms, in
Yep.
photo recognition and all sorts of other
Mm-hmm.
ways. So having human bias busters out there is important, but at some point the algorithms get so important that it's impossible to to pull apart the threads and really know what's going on. I look at like algorithmic trading actually, and I mean, yes, that obviously it extracts value from arbitrage between the prices, but at some point you have to weigh the benefit versus the cost of that. And there are a lot of worries that the algorithmic trading, makes the highs higher and the lows lower. It really increases volatility in the system. And the fact that these algorithms are so complicated that people can't figure out what's going on if there's a big disaster. So there really is a risk reward conversation around that, and a cost benefit. And again, with technology on the bigger societal level, technology is making so much things easier. I think about bookkeeping, or the way that platforms allow us to have Uber and sharing economy type things. That's fantastic. It opens opportunities for people that weren't there already. Um, but it also has a big downside. People who can't take advantage of it are left out. So we really need to look at both sides and think about how policies can even that out.
And do you think in any sense, from a societal side, our over reliance on technology, do you think that it, kind of impacts us because maybe it reduces that critical thinking that's needed to be able to make those decisions and identify the rhinos that might be in front of us?
It cuts both ways. I mean, there's some decisions you don't have to make because you can plug them. You can, like, how many of us remember phone numbers anymore? And frankly, I would rather have that part of my brain just like stay in my smartphone, which sometimes
Yeah.
feels smarter than I am. So it's the kind of thing that cuts both ways, and you really have to ask yourself, do I own technology, or does technology own me? And if there are areas where the technology is taking over, okay, well, just like decision making or biases or other things, what are the hacks that can counteract that?
It's interesting, and to the same light, relative to technology, because sometimes I'm wondering, we're so connected, we've got all this social media. Why do you think that we couldn't even have seen it coming through social media?
What's interesting, there's been a lot of work around that, and I mentioned briefly in the book that Google was trying to protect flu trends, but it ended up having a hard time distinguishing between people worrying about the flu and people who actually had the flu. So there's still a lot of work to be done around sorting out the signal from the noise. And then social media is that much harder, in that you never know if you're interacting with a sock puppet or a real person, and you never know if the real person you're interacting was getting their information from a sock puppet or not. I mean, anytime someone tries to follow me who has a short name and then a whole bunch of gobbledygook numbers afterwards, block. And I think we should be doing a lot more.
Yeah.
Social, Twitter, Facebook, all of them ought to be doing a lot more to control that kind of stuff.
No, it's very, very true. It's interesting. Yep.
Yeah. And I think to your point, I think having the balance to knowing what the role of technology is and how we leverage it, and ensuring that we're not creating the blind spots from it, but that we're using it to try to help us and leverage it to help us with respect to confronting those gray rhinos. And I think, as you said before, kind of allowing us to not only confront them, but really kind of leverage them and kind of jump on their backs and kind of help us ride forward to be stronger, as opposed to letting them kind of topple over us or run over us as a result of not seeing them. So I think it's, I think one of the things I love about technology is the fact that it is a disruptor and it causes us to think about things differently, but not to the point where we're over relying on it, where we become so complacent to not see what's right in front of us.
I gotta go check my cell phone now.
Exactly. Absolutely. Well, I know that it is. I think we're at the. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Are we at the end? Yeah, I was trying to figure out if we're at the end or not. Okay, because I was going to have her share. Because one of the things thought would be kind of interesting, Michele, is if you could share a business case where you see where the gray rhino was in the room, and just something kind of connecting the dots of kind of all the things we're talking about to where you saw it and it happened in real life to a specific company. Is there anyone that comes to any business case that comes into mind just to kind of explore and kind of show what we're talking about here?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I was in China almost a year ago in Hangzhou and was at a private dinner, and people are just wonderful. They're just so nice to me there and so enthusiastic. It's always heartwarming. But this woman was several degrees even more enthusiastic than everyone else. And it finally turned out, she said, well, there are these sort of takeaway bullets at the end of each chapter. I look at them every night. And she's a banker, and she had lent money to a company. And as she was doing her sort of daily reading, she just got more and more and more uncomfortable. And she said she actually got this company to pay back the loan early. And then they went bankrupt. So it's like, oh no, now I see why you were so happy to meet me.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, Michele. I mean, it's very insightful for us to really hear your thoughts and hear your perspectives with respect to how we. And I loved your quote of really saying, what is my gray rhino? So, challenging all of us to look within ourselves and take that responsibility on and say, how do we look at our own gray rhinos, and then how do we also ask the questions and listen to the people who have the expertise potentially and have the perspectives that we may not have. To identify what the broader gray rhinos may be beyond our world, that we can have visibility to or understanding of what that rhino may be. So before we leave today, is there one point that you would want all of us to take away, like very quickly, as far as just to summarize the gray rhino and your thoughts and your experiences into one key point that we want to walk away with?
Absolutely, but it does go back to this, envisioning this rhino coming at you with its name tattooed on its forward, and asking yourself, what is the gray rhino, and then going on and saying, okay, what am I doing about it? How well am I dealing with this? And in the book, there's a 5-stage framework for helping you to do that assessment. But it's not enough to just say, hey, oh yeah, I know about that problem, because we see so many know-it-alls, particularly in the West. I don't see it as much in Asia, but so many know-it-alls like, yeah, I know that's a problem. It's being dealt with, and then most of the time it's not. So just don't take for granted that you are dealing with the gray rhino in front of you, and that's why it's so important to do those checks on a regular basis. Even when you think you've solved it, put on your calendar, come back in 6 months or whatever, and then move on. What's the next gray rhino, and just make that a regular part of your practice.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michele. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Your work is very inspiring, and I really just appreciate the time that you spent with us.
Thanks so much. It was great talking with you guys.